During the European Middle Ages, the struggle between secular royal power and the authority of the Church was a central theme in historical development. Since the Cluniac Reform, the Church had gradually freed itself from the control of the Holy Roman Emperor and began to assert dominance over secular rulers. From the Walk to Canossa in 1077 to Pope Innocent, the third series of forceful actions against the monarchs of Western Europe, the Church's influence reached its peak. However, the rapid rise of the Capetian dynasty in France and the consolidation of royal power presented the papacy with an even more formidable opponent than the fragmented Holy Roman Empire. In 1285, following the death of Philip III, his 17-year-old son, the handsome Philip IV, ascended to the French throne and began his 29-year reign. Philip IV was a ruler of both ambition and ability. During his reign, he sought to weaken the nobility, expand royal authority, and further consolidate the power of the monarchy, laying a solid foundation for the unification of France and the rise of national consciousness. Philip IV engaged in multiple military campaigns to expand French territory. In 1294, under the pretext of feudal authority, he summoned King Edward I of England to Paris for trial. When Edward refused, Philip IV launched a war against England and seized Gascony. In 1297, he invaded Flanders and suppressed a local uprising. That same year, he repelled an attack by the Holy Roman Empire's lords on the eastern Champagne region, forcing them to recognize French sovereignty over the lands west of the Meuse River. Although this series of wars ended in victory, they also brought severe financial difficulties to the French monarchy. In response, Philip IV implemented several measures, such as increasing state taxes and confiscating the wealth of Jewish communities. However, these efforts still failed to cover the fiscal deficit caused by the wars. As a result, Philip IV turned his attention to the wealthiest social group at the time, the clergy. He ordered that taxes be levied on the clergy within France, declaring that any church property would be seized if the taxes were not paid. This move directly challenged the authority and interests of the Church. At that time, Pope Boniface VIII was a strong-willed pontiff who firmly upheld the principle of papal supremacy. In response to the king's actions, he issued the famous papal decree Clarissis Laicos in February 1296. This decree forbade clergy from paying taxes to secular rulers and prohibited laypeople, non-clerical believers, from making any claims on church property. Rulers who impose unlawful taxes shall be excommunicated, and their nations shall be deprived of all religious services. Philip IV, unlike his predecessors, refused to yield to the Pope's threats. Instead, he retaliated by declaring that no subject of the Kingdom of France was permitted to transfer gold, silver, currency, weapons, or horses to the papacy without royal approval. Furthermore, he expelled officials responsible for managing the Vatican's finances, dealing a significant blow to the economic interests of the Roman Church. At that time, Pope Boniface VIII had recently suffered a major setback after failing to mediate the Sicilian Vespers conflict, which significantly weakened his authority and position. Given these circumstances, he was not in a favorable position to risk an all-out confrontation with Philip IV, as it would further drain his resources and attention. Consequently, the Pope adopted a more conciliatory stance toward Philip IV. He later issued a new decree stating that Clarissis Laicos would no longer apply to France, allowing Philip IV to tax the Church when necessary. In August 1297, Pope Boniface VIII canonized Philip IV's grandfather, King Louis IX, as a saint. Louis IX had died in 1270, and being canonized only 27 years after his death was an exceedingly rare occurrence in Christian history. This clearly demonstrated that in the first round of confrontation, the Pope had been completely forced into a weaker position. In the year 1300, Pope Boniface VIII proclaimed it as the first Jubilee year in Christian history. As a result, 1300 became known as the first Holy Year of General Absolution. Encouraged by the Pope, over 200,000 pilgrims traveled to Rome, bringing a substantial financial windfall to the papacy. This influx of wealth helped reduce the Church's financial dependence on France, emboldening the Pope to take a more assertive stance against Philip IV. In 1301, Philip IV ordered the arrest of a French bishop who also happened to be a papal representative in France. Philip IV accused the bishop of treason and heresy. This act was a blatant violation of canon law, which stipulated that only the Pope had the authority to judge a bishop. In response, Pope Boniface VIII demanded the immediate release of the bishop and summoned the bishops of France to Rome to investigate the religious conduct of the French king. He also issued a papal bull condemning Philip IV for his numerous offenses against the Church, declaring that the king's defiance of papal authority was irrational and a sign of faithlessness. When the papal bull reached France, it enraged Philip IV. In defiance, he publicly burned the document and instructed his chief advisor, Pierre Flotte, to forge a more aggressive version of the bull. This falsified decree, written in the Pope's supposed voice, insulted the French king and proclaimed that secular rulers must submit to the Pope in all matters, affirming the absolute supremacy of the papacy. By fabricating this document, Philip IV successfully rallied the support of the French people. Capitalizing on this momentum, he convened the first-ever Estates General of France in April 1302, bringing together clergy, nobility, and commoners. During the assembly, Philip IV secured strong backing from all three estates. Each estate wrote letters to the Pope, declaring that the king answered only to God and that the Pope had no right to interfere in France's internal affairs. Outraged upon discovering Philip IV's forgery, Boniface VIII condemned him as morally corrupt. In response, he issued the Unam Sanctam, a papal bull reaffirming the Pope's supreme authority over secular rulers and prophesying that Philip IV would meet a grim fate, an ominous prediction that would later come true, though that is another story. The Unam Sanctum was, in effect, a declaration of war against Philip IV. After securing a peace treaty with England in the Treaty of Paris, Philip IV convened another Estates General. During this assembly, he fabricated numerous accusations against Boniface VIII, including charges of persecuting bishops, blasphemy, simony, sexual depravity, practicing witchcraft, and even murdering a previous pope. These allegations all served one ultimate purpose: to delegitimize Boniface VIII as an unlawful pope. Boniface VIII vehemently denounced these baseless accusations. Determined to retaliate, he planned to excommunicate Philip IV and depose him from the throne on September 8, 1303, the feast of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary. However, Philip IV decided to strike first. A day before the planned excommunication, he sent a band of mercenaries into Italy, launching a surprise attack on the papal residence in Avignon and capturing the Pope. According to the biography of Boniface VIII, the Pope did not react with panic, as some historical accounts suggest. Instead, he sat upright, firmly gripping a crucifix, facing the crisis with unwavering composure, maintaining the dignity and image of a pope. However, among the mercenaries were sworn enemies of the Pope. They stripped him of his papal crown and vestments and even physically assaulted him, an immense humiliation for any man, let alone the spiritual leader of Christianity. The mercenaries originally planned to take Boniface VIII to Paris for trial. However, when local knights and townspeople heard of the Pope's capture, they swiftly surrounded the mercenaries. Left with no alternative, the mercenaries were forced to release the Pope. Escorted by the people of Avignon, Boniface VIII returned to Rome. However, the ordeal had left him deeply shaken. he was nearly driven to madness. Just 2 months after his return, he died in humiliation and anguish. His death marked a turning point in the decline of papal authority. After Boniface VIII's death, one of the cardinals who had participated in his rescue, who was also the head of the Dominican order at the time, was elected as the new pope, taking the name Benedict XI. Upon ascending the papal throne, Benedict XI found Rome in a state of turmoil and great danger. To ensure his safety, he fled to the nearby city of Perugia. However, only 9 months after his election, Benedict XI mysteriously died. In 1305, under the strong influence of Philip IV, the College of Cardinals convened a papal election in Lyon. They elected the Bishop of Bordeaux, a close friend of the French king, as the new pope, Clement V, the other central figure in this story. Suffering from cancer and under immense pressure from Philip IV, Clement V did not travel to Rome for his coronation. Instead, he chose to be crowned in Lyon, a city in southern France. Although he initially intended to return to Rome, the city was plagued by ongoing unrest and rebellion. Finally, in 1309, under the coercion of Philip IV, Clement V relocated the papal court to Avignon, a small town not far from Lyon, marking the beginning of the 70-year-long period known as the Avignon Papacy. During his tenure as pope, Clement V appointed 24 cardinals, of whom only one was not French. He remained highly deferential to the French king, granting him the right to tax the church and clergy. Furthermore, he dissolved the wealthy and powerful Knights Templar, appointed archbishops chosen by the French king, and generally complied with Philip IV's wishes. The only issue on which he refused to yield was his rejection of Philip IV's demand to put Pope Boniface VIII on trial. The dissolution of the Knights Templar under pressure from Philip IV and the execution of many of its members by burning at the stake became the greatest stain on Clement V's legacy. This event deeply affected his authority, reputation, and conscience. Stricken with guilt over his inability to save the Templars, he succumbed to grief and died just 2 months after their downfall. However, the papacy's subjugation to the French crown did not end with his death. Over the next 70 years, 6 successive popes resided in Avignon, all of whom, like Clement V, were French. During this period, 134 new cardinals were appointed, at least 112 of whom were French. Previously, both the papacy and the College of Cardinals had been overwhelmingly dominated by Italians. During these 7 decades, the papacy lost the independence and prestige it had gained during the Cluniac reforms. It effectively became the French papacy, reduced to a mere religious administrative office under the French king's control. In 1377, under the urging of the Holy Roman Emperor and Saint Catherine of Siena, Pope Gregory XI overcame numerous obstacles and finally returned to Rome, bringing an end to the 70-year-long Avignon exile. However, just a year after his return, Gregory XI passed away, plunging the papacy into another crisis. The Roman clergy elected an Italian, Urban VI, as the new pope, while the French cardinals chose a Swiss candidate, Clement VII. Soon after, with the support of the French clergy, Clement VII returned to Avignon, marking the beginning of the 40-year-long Western Schism. From the name Avignon Papacy, it may seem as though the papacy had lost its independence during those 70 years, becoming a vassal or even a puppet of the French monarchy. However, many later historians have exaggerated the extent of this event's impact on the Church. Historical records suggest that during the Avignon period, the papacy continued to function normally in terms of financial income, taxation, and religious administration, maintaining significant influence over Christian kingdoms such as England, France, Germany, and Spain. Moreover, While Avignon is now part of France, at the time it was actually a territory of the Papal States. In the late 13th century, the Pope had purchased the city of Avignon from Charles I, the brother of King Louis IX of France. As a result, Avignon remained under papal control as church property until the French Revolution in the late 18th century. In essence, the relocation of the papal court was simply a move from one part of the Papal States to another, comparable to a country shifting its capital, rather than the Pope being forcibly relocated into French territory. Thus, it is misleading to claim that the Pope was a prisoner of the French king. Furthermore, after the death of Philip IV, France went through 3 kings in a short period, creating domestic instability and weakening its influence over the Pope. The real reason why the popes did not immediately heed the Roman citizens' calls to return was not French control, but rather the ongoing factional conflicts in Rome, persistent rebellions, severe flooding of the Tiber River, and frequent outbreaks of plague. Compared to Rome, Avignon offered greater stability, allowing the papacy to exercise better control over its affairs. Additionally, Avignon's location on major trade routes brought economic benefits to the Church. Nevertheless, the 70-year Avignon exile had a profound impact on the authority and legitimacy of the papacy, sowing the seeds for the Western Schism and, ultimately, the Protestant Reformation that followed.